Welcome back to E Squared Emporium for all things AP Psychology. We're continuing our discussion, this time on genetics and behavior. So behavioral genetics is the study of the power and limitations of the genes on who we are. So interesting to note, humans share 93% of our DNA and genes with a rhesus monkey. We share 98% with chimps. So that 2 to 7% difference in the genetic material, it's obviously a significant difference. So 2% between how chimps behave, their ability to talk, and how we behave, our ability to talk, just 2% makes a huge significant difference. But before we get, too arrogant about our humanity, it's important to remember that we share 44% of our DNA with fruit flies, and we share 25% of our DNA with a banana. So heredity, also heritability, if you see that word, it's basically what we inherit from our parents. It's the proportion of variation among individuals that we attribute to genes. Again, this is DNA inherited. See the word herited right there for heredity. It is a mathematical formula, kind of a simple mathematical formula. We're still learning how to understand it. So genes or DNA are passed down. There's 23 pairs of chromosomes, 23 from our mother, 23 from our father. That's 46 total. And the father is who determines the gender. And we need to tell that to Henry VIII. If you remember in history, he kept blaming his poor wives for why he never had a son. Well, he did eventually have a son, but he blamed his wives, and it was actually Henry's fault, sorry. So our genes, their location and their composition, I've given you these notes already, so you already have chromosome, gene, DNA, some of this simple vocabulary to make sure you know it. So in the nucleus of every cell, we have 46 chromosomes. Now, the human genome process started James Watson, 1990, mapped the human species, identified 25,000 genes, and your textbooks will say it's all completed. 2003, we're all done. We know everything about the human genome, but we don't. We're still finding more genome patterns, more genome sequences. We're understanding them more and more every day. There is still so much of this that is unsolved, not resolved. We're still making new discoveries. There is plenty for you to still discover. So genetics, one gene alone is not responsible for all of our complex behavior, and sometimes we tend to simplify it. We're going to look at aggression and anger, and we're going to look at the one gene that they're sort of tagging for that. But we know that it's a combination, and it's so much more than that that leads to our complex behavior when we talk about IQ, EQ, criminal behavior, altruism, attachment. So we have a tendency to simplify the process. Disposition is what is already. This already exists, or it's destined to be. It's there, it's encoded in you. It's your phenotype. It's, the color of your eyes or your hair color. It's your metabolism set point, which can be changed, but you tend to have a genetic disposition towards that. It's your secondary sex characteristics. Predisposition is everything that has not yet occurred, and it doesn't have to occur, but it's there if all the factors are there. So if you don't have the environmental stimuli, it will not manifest. I like to use my Amish example, right? If you were raised in an Amish family, but you have a predisposition for drug addiction or alcoholism, and you are raised in a culture that does not have access to drugs or alcohol, then you will probably not develop that. So things like weight issues, diabetes, our preference for high sugar foods, that can all be a predisposition that we can see in your genetic code. Addiction, depression, anxiety, certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia, certain physical illnesses like cancer and Tay-Sachs. That's why the doctor will always ask you if these things run in your family. It doesn't mean you have to have them. It means you have to be careful. Maybe eat more kale and less cake, or do the things you need to do to make sure that this does not get triggered in your DNA. So the argument we discuss a lot the debate is nature or nurture, and this debate's been around for quite a long time. We now believe it's a combination of both. So it's the importance of our inner nature, and we should know the word innate. Innate means the qualities you are born with, the personality you are born with. It's in you already. Versus your personal experiences, everything you're going to experience from the moment that you're born. And I would even argue that in the womb you're already having an experience. It's already an environment. In determining or causing your differences in physical and behavioral traits. So here's an example down here just with hair, right? If we look at the color of your hair and the style of your hair, well, you genetically got, maybe you say, I have my mother's hair, I have my father's hair. Maybe, redheads run in your family or dark hair runs in your family. But based on your environment, maybe you want a buzz cut, maybe you want to shave it all off, maybe you want a mustache, maybe you want different kinds of hair. That's how your environment influences you and your hair. But sometimes both, like in this last picture, being out in the sun, which is the environment, could bleach your hair a little lighter than its natural, normal color. We already looked at this chart. It should look fairly familiar to you, and I said you were going to see it again. So here's all the broad spectrum of our different theories from nature to nurture. So here we are in the biological approach, all the way over here on my left. And it is genetic, hormonal, neurochemical, and we believe it is the way you are born when we're in the biological approach. It is nature, 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 DNA, and genetics, and that's the argument when we're in this approach to psychology. But we're going to eventually work our way all the way over to behaviorism, which would argue more of the nurture side. And again, these are some of our older theories, but modern views have a complex interplay. We believe that it is both genes and the environment that shape our behavior and our development. So again, just to wrap it up, nature is born that way, as Lady Gaga said, innate, pre-wired, influenced by our genetic inheritance from our parents and grandparents, biological factors. Nurture is, I was made that way. Nurture is the influence of all the factors that have happened to you since conception. Again, we could argue that the womb is really your first environment. So we are the product of everything we're exposed to, everything we will experience, and everything we have learned. So here's my question for you. What if Shaq were raised in a home where they never had a basketball, didn't watch it, didn't know about it, never played it, never talked about it, he never got to handle one? Would he have been able to become the great Shaq that we know? Or maybe he would have made different choices, right? Was he nurtured into that, even though he does seem to have a natural inclination to being excellent at the sport? Well, how about Morgan Wallen? Could Morgan Wallen have been a very sweet and tender kindergarten teacher instead of playing country music? So what part of that is his nature, and what part of that was he nurtured into? And what if Taylor Swift pursued science instead of music? Could Dr. Swift be an astrophysicist? Again, what was in her nature, and what was she nurtured to grow up to become? So we look at twin studies a lot in this discussion of genetics. Now we can only look at correlations because we've already discussed why it is not ethical to test on twins. So we can't do the test on twins. We can only have correlations with IQ and so forth. So we've got the Olsen twins here and the Williams sisters. So genetic research on twins, we see that the higher the genetic relationship, we call this a concordance rate. Twin research is called a concordance rate. It means the more similar two people are. So when we're comparing different types of twins or different types of siblings or different types of genetic family members, we're looking at concordance rate. So how high is their rate in similar IQ or similar rates of depression or similar metabolism weight set points or the similarity for red hair? So we study twins because they share genetic material, but again, all we can do is collect data and look at concordance rates. That's it. So monozygotic, usually abbreviated MZ, these are genetically identical. One fertilized egg splits into two in the womb. Typically, they're the same sex. There have been cases where they're not. They do tend to look alike. Now, the only difference is fingerprints, and that is because fingerprints are formed when your little fingers press the outside of the womb, or the inside, I'm sorry, of the womb. You are getting little swirls. That's how your swirls and ridges form. So that's the only thing. Their DNA would be the same. Everything else would be the same, but fingerprints would be different. Dizygotic, DZ, these are two eggs that would be fertilized. They could be within moments of each other fertilized. And of course, we can have triplets and many more combinations than just this. They have 50% of the genes in common. Here you may see boy-girl. You may see a lot more variety in how we end up with size and hair color, and they may not look alike at all. And here they're really no different than any other siblings that could be born at a different time. So what do we know about identical twins and looking at their studies? Again, these are just concordance studies. We see extroversion tests. We're going to talk about introvert and extrovert. This means, how much you like to get out there into the public and talk and be seen and all of that. We see that they are more similar on extroversion tests. Neuroticism has to do with anxiety and worry. They're also more similar on those two traits, especially when we compare to fraternal twins. We can see things like Alzheimer's. If one identical twin has Alzheimer's, there is a 60% chance the second twin will develop Alzheimer's. With fraternal twins, it's only 30%. Look at how much it dropped. Here's the weird one. If one identical twin gets divorced, you have a 5.5 times that the second identical twin will also get divorced. Now, that seems to be very environmental, and that's really interesting to look at. Now, a fraternal twin, that drops only a 1.6 times chance of getting a divorce if another sibling has a divorce. So in class, we're going to look at the most famous twin study. It's the Minnesota Twin Study, Bouchard et al. Et al. Means and all the others, right? So and others. So Bouchard and several other researchers who we will look at in 1990. They published in 1990. They started in 1979. So this is what we call a longitudinal study, right? Because that was a long time. So they were looking at identical twins that were raised in separate families, like one was adopted out to a different home. And typically they did not know their birth parents. They did not maybe even know that they were adopted until this study. And then they compared those twins to twins who were raised together, never separated, never adopted out. And they wanted to see how many similarities do identical twins have if they're not raised in the same environment. How much of it is your nature, your DNA, your genetics, and how much of it is just the environment. You were raised in the same family with the same parents. So this was cross-cultural, all over the world, so we could say this was meta-analysis. The average age of this study was 41. A lot of other studies are done with teenagers, but this one was the average age was in their 40s. It took over 50 hours of testing and interviews and so forth. Remember, I said some of these studies take a very long amount of time. The results, there's more results than this, but some of the more important results, they found that 70% of IQ is genetic, meaning inherited, meaning both twins, whether they were raised together or raised apart, shared a very similar IQ. But in class, we're going to break this down and look at it. They actually share a similar laugh. They share similar hobbies. They share a similar taste in jobs and cars and spouses. They share similar medical histories, share a similar weight set point. All kinds of interesting stuff that we will take a look at, and we'll see some videos in class. So is this just a coincidence? Well, a couple of criticisms of the study. They did use the media in order to recruit their twins. So, you're getting publicity out there, and media could have its own confounding variable there. There were some ethical concerns because the twins were reunited before the researchers were in the room. So how much did the twins get to compare notes and talk and do things without a researcher there to kind of keep the parameters set. So there was no adequate control of this. And we also can't assume that twins raised together even have the same experience. Two twins could be raised in the same house, and one could be better at school than the other. One could be better at sports than the other. One could feel like they're getting more attention from the parents than the other. So even two twins in the same house may not have this kind of exactness. Could we find two strangers of the same age and the same gender somewhere else on the planet who would have similar life experiences? Could you find two 24-year-old men who went to the same university and, maybe they liked the same shows and they played the same video games? Could we not find similar comparisons? And the other thing is that adoption agencies tend to place twins into similar households than the one that they came from. So those are some of the criticisms of the study. Moving on to just general family studies, not necessarily twins. We all share genetic relatedness to each other. So ordinary siblings share 50% genes, regardless of your birth order. You share 50% genes, 25% with your grandparents, 12.5% with your first cousins. So correlation should increase if the heritability, if the genetic relatedness is high. So in other words, if there's a strong enough correlation between IQ, right, we should see that correlation at 50% with siblings, at 25% with grandparents. It should be very strong between mother and father and child, much weaker in second cousins and strangers. Moving on to adoption studies, and yes, animals adopt too. So we have a lot of different terms in adoption studies. We have the genetic relatives, which we call the biological parents. We may or may not have a lot of information about the biological parents, and that would be the nature side of the argument. Then we have the nurture side of the argument. We have the mom and dad adoptive parents, the ones who raised the child. They're the environment the child was raised in. Remembering, though, the child did spend 9 months in the womb, which is still an environment, but that would be the biological parent's environment. And that would make a difference if the biological parents smoked or drank or did anything during those 9 months. Then we have all the environmental relatives related to the adopted parents, but not necessarily biologically related to the child. Siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. But if you talk to adopted couples, there is no difference. They all love their children equally. We do see that adopted families are screened better than biological families. We don't give you any test to be a biological parent. You have to get more data and you have to give more paperwork in order to adopt a pet from the local humane society than you do to be a biological parent. There kind of is no screening. So adopted families are screened very, very closely. There tends to be less physical abuse. There tends to be less divorce, less problems financially and so forth within an adopted family. So what do we see with adopted studies? When we compare genetic and environmental influences, will the child grow up to behave more like the biological mother or the adopted mother? I don't mean to leave fathers out with this, but a lot of these studies are done with the correlation to the mother. So the studies show that the child's personality resembles the biological parents. Let's say that again. The child's personality, and we'll talk in a whole detail about what your personality is. But your personality, are you fussy? Are you happy? Are you moody? Are you an optimist? It tends to resemble the biological parents more than your caregivers. So for instance, when we see children taken away from addictive parents, we still see that addiction runs through the child. Even though you were raised in a house with no addictive family members in the adopted home, addiction is one of those things that still seems to be biologically linked. Now, here's where environment does influence you. So we tend to take on our adopted parents' values and attitudes and manners. We take on their religion. We take on their politics. So that's really interesting. So all of those ways an adopted family can influence us. But sometimes that DNA, those genes, are still hardwired in there. So we do see a combination of both. Here was an interesting study done in France. They took an infant from a very low socioeconomic status home. So that basically translates into a child from a poor family, a struggling financially family. And they matched them to a high socioeconomic home. And then they looked years later, and they found that the child's IQ scores went up 12 to 16 points, one standard deviation, because 15 points approximately is one standard deviation in IQ points. So this means that putting a child into a more enriched environment can actually raise IQ. So this study shows us that environment can override the genetics, the DNA. So taking a child that might have scored, say, 100, and now they're 115 or even 130, now they're in the gifted IQ status, simply by putting them in a higher socioeconomic home. And this makes sense if we think about, well, we'll talk about how the vocabulary words that are used in a higher economic home, they have a much broader vocabulary that's used, many more words, many larger words, words with larger syllables. More books are available, more museums, more travel outside the country. This is what we mean by more enriched environment. And so that does make sense. Music. Music is also typically a part of this too, playing a musical instrument, often the ability to have a tutor. All of these things will definitely help. So here's where we're going to end with adoption studies. People who grow up together don't necessarily resemble one another, whether they're biologically related or not. So in an adopted home, you may not resemble each other in personality, but in a biological home, you may not resemble each other in personality. You may be the exact opposite of one of your sisters or brothers. We do see the personalities of parents are not always related to the personalities of their children, even in a biological home. Two studies with animals that are interesting. We see that chimpanzees who were raised in the same zoo, it didn't matter. The babies still behave like the biological parent. So they took the chimp babies away from the biological mother and gave the chimp babies to a different mother to raise them, maybe a more loving mother, maybe a more nurturing mother, in a different part of the zoo or even in a different location, and it didn't matter. They found that those chimp babies were much more like the biological parent than the adopted parent. In another study, they switched monkey babies at birth. Again, they raised the babies by a different mother, and again, they still showed the signs of the biological mother. Now, again, we can't see what we said was changed were the morals and the values and the politics, and those things just aren't there for chimps and monkeys. We don't see values and politics and religion the same way. We just see the biology. So in criminal behavior, we see that if the biological father has a criminal record, 21% of the percent chance that the son will also have a criminal record. If only the adopted father has a criminal record, then only 11% chance that the son will also eventually have a criminal record. But if both the biological and the adopted father have a record, then there's a 36% chance that that son will have a criminal record, right? So we go from less than a quarter to around 10% to about, a little over 33%. But if neither father has a record, then the son's chance is only 10%. So again, with criminal behavior between fathers and sons, we see environment is combined with genetics. And epigenetics is a very, very interesting topic, and we will spend some time in class talking about this. This is cutting edge. You're going to learn about this in college, and it is a fascinating topic. It is an emerging area of research. We are learning how the environment will influence the expression of our genes. And how will these modifications affect our body and how our body reads our DNA sequence? So some of these epigenetic changes can last a lifetime, but what's fascinating is that some of them are passed on to the next generation. And we're finding they're passed on with mice up to 16 generations. So you could be experiencing something that your great, 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 great grandparents went through. So in our history, if you look back far enough in your family history, there was time of stress, there was time of Great Depression, there was time of lack of food, there was World War I, there was World War II, there was poverty. All of this leads us to anxiety and risk aversion, and it is actually carried on our DNA. It is layered onto our DNA and it is carried onto our children. So what if the depression that we're trying to treat or the anxiety that we're trying to treat isn't even ours? What if it's somebody else's and we're just a carrier of it? We're just a carrier of that expression of that gene. And so we're going to look at what they call the orange blossom study and what they found out with mice and how it might translate to humans. Fascinating stuff. All right, now you are prepared for class, and stop right there and we'll do the rest together.